Okay, everybody, Dr. Rafich here from Vet Triage. We are continuing with this issue of JAVMA from July 1st, 2015, and we are talking about enhancing clinical decision-making, the importance of the role of the scientific literature in clinical decision-making. This study comes out of Kansas State University. This is a nice summary of how we should think of medical literature, and unfortunately, this is not prioritized as much as it ought to be in the veterinary profession. And this is the kind of thing that we're literally talking about when you're talking about misinformation, disinformation, whatever else, because if the media gets their hands on a literature, or if a new graduate or a vet student gets in the hands of literature and they don't adequately decipher the weaknesses and strengths of this paper, where it falls in the hierarchy of literature, then it goes wild, and people start making judgments on the conclusions of a paper without critically evaluating it. So it becomes a big problem in the field, especially with new grads. All right, so here we go. At some point in their careers, veterinarians may question the emphasis on the use of scientific literature rather than clinical observations and experience to support clinical decision making. Clinical observations play an important role in veterinary decision making, and practitioners should not discount the value of clinical observations as a source of knowledge. In fact, clinical experiences form the framework with which all literature is interpreted. Now, here's the problem with this: is a medical board going to take into account experience? Right? That's the problem. So let's say a medical board is investigating you because somebody complained about your veterinary work, and you say, well, my clinical experience, X, Y, and Z, but then the medical board says, yeah, but the literature doesn't support that, or it says something different or whatever. How much are they going to take into account your personal experience, your professional experience, rather? So I think there's some unfortunate weaknesses with the system, because veterinary experience should play an important role in this process of deciding what to do with the case, what direction to take a case. But then at the same time, if they get in trouble for not following the literature, and then I do find that medical boards are also weak in interpreting literature. They don't take into account professional experience as much as they should, and they, as far as I'm concerned, they don't have a strong understanding of the pros and cons of the medical literature hierarchy. So although I love the points being made here, I don't know how real it is when it comes to like medical board complaints, for example. When new ideas are introduced on the medical community, scientific literature serves as a medium through which practitioners can learn new things without having to do so independently. Limitations of biological observations. Causal associations can be accurately identified when initiating cause and outcome are easily detected. There are no interactions involving multiple factors, and the cause and outcome are closely spaced in time. However, when a causative factor cannot be identified by the senses alone, when multiple causes interact to bring about an outcome, or when the causes are separated from outcomes by long periods, erroneous conclusions can be made about causation. Most cause and effect relationships in veterinary medicine are of this nature. Advancements in disease prevention and treatment were slow or non-existent before specific strategies were developed to control bias or systemic error, and rigorously test hypotheses throughout the use of statistical tests. The reasons that advancements in the medical sciences lagged behind those in other sciences for hundreds of years are the same reasons that veterinarians must embrace the scientific method and use the information from rigorous, well-designed studies that control for factors that might bias the results. Rather, the lag can be explained by the fundamental characteristics of biological science, which differ from those of physics, chemistry, and other sciences. Interpretation of the effects of interventions on a biological system is impeded by intra and individual variation, bias, and complexity. When a mechanical object or system breaks or falls to perform as expected, the cause and effect can be accurately identified. However, with a biological system like an animal or microbe or a population fails to perform as expected, and a particular intervention is provided, many unknown, unseen factors may also become involved. Biological systems invoke complex homeostatic mechanisms, remarkable abilities to adapt to deficiencies in various factors, remove insults like infectious agents, toxicants, or damaged tissue, and repair damage and multifaceted interactions among host, insult, and environment to mediate the extent of protection or damage. All of these make biological systems infinitely more complex than even the most complicated machines. All right, next section, acknowledging and controlling for bias. Veterinarians observe daily the variation within and among animals and biological systems. Awareness of the range of behaviors, physiological indices, and growth and reproductive performance indicators for healthy and compromised animals is important for problem solving. Differentiating the expected variation in responses from that attributed to the effects of an intervention requires careful data collection and probability calculations like statistical tests. Well-designed scientific studies also differ from clinical observation and experience because, by design, explicit constraints are implemented to control for sources of bias. Common, often inadvertent biases associated with clinical observations are typically grouped into the categories of selection bias, information bias, and confounding. Selection bias exists when animals differ among study groups in more ways than just the intervention or putative risk factor assessed. For example, selection bias may occur when a vet is more likely to administer the perceived best treatment to patients with the most severe symptoms, which could result in an underestimation of the response to treatment because those patients would presumably be more difficult to treat than patients with less severe symptoms, or an overestimation because those patients might show the greatest clinical response. However, this type of bias can be controlled for in scientific papers to improve the validity of comparisons. Information bias is also common given that veterinarians rarely have full and equal information about the animals for which they provide care. Information bias exists when the degree of scrutiny differs among animals or groups. In clinical practice, such bias can easily occur when comparing the effects of a new intervention with those of a more traditional intervention because animals receiving the new intervention may be more closely observed than those receiving the more traditional and thus previously evaluated intervention. Confounding can occur when two factors are associated with each other but not evenly distributed among the subjects evaluated, making it difficult to identify which factors is truly associated with the outcome of interest. Well-designed scientific studies involve use of several techniques to control for bias, including random selection of subjects that meet the study inclusion criteria, the random allocation of subjects to treatment groups, and binding of outcome assessors with regard to the treatment groups to which subjects were assigned. However, even randomized controlled trials retain some degree of bias, and that bias can be substantial when techniques to control for it are not rigorously applied. So, for example, there was a study that looked at 250 controlled trials from 33 meta-analyses and looking at the method of blinding that was not clearly indicated in those studies, and they found that the effectiveness of interventions by a mean of 30% to 48% were exaggerated. Another study found even greater impact of failure to effectively blind outcome assessors, with treatment effectiveness exaggerated by approximately 70% when assessors were not blinded versus were blinded. So it's a big deal. Bias can be a very powerful influencer of the outcome. So this is also referred to as optimism error or wish bias, by which unblinded assessors identify fewer treatment failures than do blinded assessors, particularly during assessment of treatment groups versus control groups. This does not mean that the researchers were intentionally deceitful, but by human nature, unblinded outcome assessors may consciously or subconsciously perceive a difference among treatments that were not actually existing because they believed their study hypothesis was true, which resulted in a misclassification of outcomes. Another drawback of clinical observation and experience that is addressed in well-designed scientific studies is a limited availability to detect and quantify multiple relationships between two or more factors that affect clinically important outcomes. Accurate assessments are more likely to be made in veterinary practice when a single intervention has a direct effect on an important outcome and no other factors influence that effect. However, in addition to the influences of bias and biological variation on validity of clinical observations, health outcomes are rarely influenced by a single factor. Now, common types of studies reported in the veterinary literature. Collection of data in an accurate and unbiased manner, followed by unbiased analysis of the data, are foundations for scientific method and provide the opportunity to make more accurate inferences about veterinary interventions that would be achieved through clinical observation and experience. The scientific method of problem investigation begins before data collection with the assertion of a clear hypothesis that can be tested, either supported or rejected, on the basis of the data to be collected. A well-stated hypothesis will predict a measurable outcome and will be stated in a manner to ensure that a result that supported the stated hypothesis would not also support alternate hypotheses. This contrasts with reliance on clinical observations, for which a presumption of cause and effect is made only after the outcome has been observed. Development of a clear hypothesis prior to data collection is necessary to protect against bias that could occur when data are collected or hypotheses are generated after the outcome is known. So here's a chart of a scientific method there. I'll read those steps now. Number one is develop a hypothesis that makes a prediction that excludes alternate hypotheses, including a statement of the observations needed to reject the hypothesis. The second step is test a prediction through a use of a study design that controls for bias. The third is evaluate the observed results with appropriate statistical tests. The fourth is interpret the study results in the context of the statistical tests performed. The ability of the study design to control for bias and the amount of consistency of results from other studies with the same or similar hypothesis. And number five, revise the original hypothesis. Six is repeat as needed. The types of studies reported in the veterinary literature can be generally classified as systemic reviews, meta-analyses, randomized controlled trials, including clinical or field trials and laboratory-based trials, cohort studies, cross-sectional studies, case control studies, case series, and case reports. Systematic reviews involve a rigorous and clearly defined process to provide summaries of previous studies on a specific topic and typically provide a more broad-based conclusion than for a single trial. Randomized controlled trials are an example of experimental studies in which investigators assign subjects in an unbiased manner to receive the intervention or exposure being investigated, or a control intervention, usually a placebo, sham treatment, or existing treatment. In contrast, the observational studies, like cohort, case-controlled, and cross-sectional designs, investigators draw inferences about the effects of an intervention or putative risk factor in a clinically relevant natural setting through observation of the subjects without assigning them to receive particular interventions or undergo certain exposures. In general, experimental designs, such as randomized controlled trials, provide the greatest control of bias and confounding, but in doing so yield results that may not be directly applicable to natural clinical situations. In contrast, observational studies in general yield results that are clinically applicable but lack rigorous control of factors that could bias or confound the results. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So well-designed systematic reviews can provide the strongest evidence about clinically important questions because they synthesize the results of multiple studies. The key characteristics of a systematic review include a clearly stated set of objectives, an explicit, reproducible method for the literature research, including specific eligibility criteria for the literature, a search method designed to identify all reports of studies that meet the eligibility criteria, an assessment of the validity of the findings of included studies, like a thorough assessment of risk of bias, and systematic synthesis and reporting of the characteristics and findings of the included studies. Meta-analysis, another form of research synthesis, is designed to provide a statistical summary of the combined results of similar studies. Although systematic reviews and meta-analyses are becoming more common in veterinary medicine than they were in the past, they have limitations. The effect of publication bias is generally to overestimate the magnitude of effect of risk factors, protective factors, and interventions. The compelling strength of a well-designed and executed systematic review is that the synthesis of results from numerous studies yields the best available estimate of the true magnitude of benefit or harm of a risk factor reported in a single article. Next is randomized control studies. Well-designed randomized control trials provide rigorous control for many types of bias that can arise when testing the effect of an intervention. This type of study design provides strong evidence that an intervention is involved in the causation of or recovery from disease because the intervention can be shown to precede the outcome. Thus, randomized control trials are limited for assessment of prognosis or economic outcomes. Now, cohort studies. Of the observational study designs, well-designed cohort studies provide the strongest evidence for use in clinical decision making. Prospective cohort studies start with the collection of data from groups of subjects that lack disease but differ in some characteristics of interest, like an exposure, for example, at the time they enter the study. Then, data regarding the outcomes of interest are collected over time. In contrast, retrospective cohort studies involve use of a database or medical records to provide information on exposures and many times outcomes that was collected before the study was actually conducted. Retrospective studies are efficient when a hypothesized risk factor or exposure is uncommon, and they can be completed in a short period at lower expense than prospective studies, but they lack assurance that data for all study subjects were collected in exactly the same manner. And for those of you who watch this channel, hear me talk about retrospective studies all the time and the weaknesses for it. Cohort studies are typically performed over longer periods and with populations and environments that are more representative of those encountered in clinical practice than would be possible in randomized controlled trials. Cohort studies are also appropriate for evaluation of long-term prognosis and can be particularly informative for investigation of associations between uncommon factors and outcomes. Next one, case-controlled studies. Case-controlled studies, subjects with and without the outcome of interest are identified and their history of exposure to specific factors is compared between two groups. These studies can be conducted in a retrospective manner, i.e. by the use of medical records to identify animals with and without the outcome, or on a prospective basis, meaning enrollment of cases and controls as animals develop the outcome with subsequent collection of historical information for each group. These are more rapid and less expensive. They provide some protection against bias, but they are more prone to selection and information bias or confounding than are randomized controlled trials, cohort studies, and even cross-sectional studies. Case-control studies can be the most appropriate for investigations involving uncommon outcomes. Second to last is cross-sectional studies. These require less time and fewer resources. They involve concurrent collection of data on putative risk factors or exposures and outcomes of interest. Although clinicians cannot make conclusions about cause and effect with this design, cross-sectional studies yield information about an association that may be investigated further through the use of more rigorous study designs. And then finally, case reports and case series. These are not controlled. These are purely descriptive. They lack control for bias and confounding. They have limited generalizability of findings. They have no valid means by which to identify factors that may interact to influence observed outcomes. Now, last section is limitations of well-designed studies. Despite the advantages of scientific studies over clinical observation experience alone and providing information for decision-making, the scientific method has limitations. First, studies must be well designed to account for variation and control for bias. In addition, studies can only be designed to effectively investigate a few simple two-way interactions like between sex and age, for example. Studies with a greater control of bias and confounding, like randomized controlled studies, are often conducted in highly artificial environments. When they are conducted in clinically relevant environments, variation in the animals and environments used is purposely restricted, thereby limiting the scope of clinical situations to which the findings can be directly applied. On the other hand, observational studies involve selection of subjects from populations comparable with at least some practice settings, but at the sacrifice of strict control for bias and confounding. Regardless, research efforts are constrained by cost, space, and time in general. So clinical summary, development of specific strategies to separate treatment effects from random biological variation, reduce or eliminate the effects of bias, account for confounding factors, and identify and quantify interactions among factors associated with outcome has led to an unprecedented advancements in medical knowledge since the first half of the 20th century. Practicing veterinarians must value and incorporate into their decision-making processes the results of rigorous research studies reported in the scientific literature. And then I'm going to show you, in case you want to pause this, kind of small font, but this is a nice chart that outlines everything that we're talking about here. I'm going to read it just as a nice summary of what we're trying to show here. All right. Study type. Systematic review or meta-analyses. The strengths. This involves the use of full body of literature to estimate the direction and magnitude of effect of potential risk factors, protective factors, and interventions. It provides analytical methods to estimate the magnitude of effect and degree of certainty. Limitations. Restricted to combining studies with a similar design and duration to follow-up, like a meta-analysis, and findings are subject to publication bias. The next study type is randomized controlled trial. This allows for good control for bias and confounding, provides strongest evidence for cause and effect relationships. Limitations. It involves restrictive study population environment that may limit generalizability of results in real-world settings. It allows testing of few variables. It often involves a brief follow-up period between intervention and outcome assessment. It involves experimentally induced, meaning not naturally occurring disease in some situations. The next study is retrospective or prospective cohort study. Strengths include involves use of real-world population environment able to test many variables, test for uncommon risk factors, allows prolonged follow-up period between factors of exposure and outcomes. Limitations, it can be prone to selection bias, information bias, and confounding. It can be expensive to conduct prospectively because of the long follow-up period between factors or exposures and outcomes, and subjects can be lost to follow-up when conducted prospectively. The next study design is case control study. Strengths include involving use of subjects from real-world populations and environments. It can be used to investigate risk factors for uncommon diseases while involving few animals. Less expensive to conduct than randomized controlled trials and prospective cohort studies. It can generate questions that can be investigated by the use of study types with better control for bias and confounding. Limitations, prone to selection bias, information bias, and confounding, does not provide evidence for causation because relative timing of the occurrence of risk factors and outcomes is unclear. The next study is cross-sectional. The cross-sectional study strengths involves use of subjects from real-world populations and environments. It's inexpensive, can generate questions that can be investigated through use of study types with better control of bias and confounding. Limitations, prone to selection bias, information bias, and confounding. It does not provide evidence for causation because relative timing of risk factors and outcomes become unclear. And then finally, case report or case series. Strengths are simple and inexpensive, generates questions that can be investigated later on for the other studies that can control bias and confounding, but limitations, it's only descriptive for clinical experience, does not control for biologic variation, bias, confounding, and interactions among factors. So I wish there was some system in place where someone was reading a paper and it would say, if you imagine it virtually, online, you can click a button and it tells you a quick synopsis of pros and cons in general of what that paper has, because this is such simple parameters when it's broken down like this. Is a great overview, but it's really lacking in not just general public, because they're not medically trained people, but still the general population is becoming more savvy with this, but for our veterinary students and veterinarians. So well done to this paper, and hopefully it helped enlighten you folks who try to go by literature. All right, we'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care.